Beyond the Gates spoilers tease that Eva cannot accept the cruelty of her mother, Leslie. This truth is not something that suddenly appeared, but something that has weighed on her heart for years, festering like a shadow she could never escape. Eva grew up surrounded by her mother's ambition, watching how Leslie would manipulate, belittle, and destroy others simply to secure her own position at the top. At first, Eva believed that this was survival, that the world required sharpness, even ruthlessness, to overcome the endless cruelty life often handed out. But as she grew older, Eva realized her mother's hunger was never about survival, it was about domination, and about filling a void that no wealth or status could ever satisfy. The turning point for Eva came when Leslie's behavior toward the Dupree family became impossible to ignore. The Duprees were not perfect, but they were decent, and they had done nothing to warrant Leslie's relentless cruelty. It began subtly, cutting remarks slipped into social gatherings, whispers that corroded their reputation, business maneuvers designed to corner them financially. Eva tried to rationalize it at first, telling herself her mother was only defending their household, protecting what they had built. But the more she saw, the more she realized this was not about protection at all. Leslie's war against the Duprees was a game, a twisted performance that gave her joy in proving she could still control and humiliate anyone she deemed beneath her. Eva had pleaded with her mother countless times, her words dripping with a desperation she hated herself for. She had said, "Live with dignity, live with peace." She had begged Leslie to stop waging unnecessary battles, to stop treating life as if it were a stage on which she alone must shine while others suffered in the shadows. But Leslie never listened. The older she became, the more her arrogance grew, and the more her desire to flaunt her wealth hardened. Money became not just security but a weapon, a tool for revenge against those who had once laughed at her, belittled her, or tried to block her ascent. And the cruel irony was that many of those enemies had long since moved on, while Leslie remained stuck, still needing to win battles that no longer existed in anyone else's mind. Bill and Ted were among those old rivals. Years ago, they had mocked Leslie when she was still clawing her way upward, before she had the fortune, the houses, and the influence she now wielded. For them, it had been just another act of casual cruelty, a way to make themselves feel superior. But for Leslie, it became a wound she never allowed to heal. When she finally rose to power and wealth, she carried their names like a curse on her tongue. Every opportunity she had, she flaunted her success before them, turning every social gathering into a battlefield. And now, with more money and influence than ever, Leslie wanted to make the show even grander, to ensure Bill and Ted never forgot who she had become. Eva had once played along. She had been younger, naive, swept up in the intoxicating energy of her mother's vengeance. She had laughed at the cruel jokes, dressed in the gowns her mother bought, stood by her side as they entered glittering rooms filled with enemies turned spectators. But with time, the glamour curdled, the glitter turned to ash. Eva began to feel suffocated by the emptiness beneath it all. These victories were hollow, these parties meaningless, and her mother's laughter sounded more like a scream in disguise. The final straw came when Leslie targeted the Duprees with a level of venom Eva had never seen before. It was no longer just words or veiled threats, it was destruction. Contracts sabotaged, livelihoods threatened, and whispers so poisonous that their youngest daughter was reduced to tears every time she set foot in public. Eva watched from the sidelines, horrified, unable to reconcile the woman who had raised her with the monsters standing before her. It was then that she knew she had to act, not just with words, but with choice. This time, Eva decided, there would be no warnings, no ultimatums she did not intend to keep. She would act. She would show her mother, not with threats but with finality, that her cruelty had gone too far. For the first time, she was ready to give up the comfort and riches she had known all her life, if that was the price of freedom. Wealth had once bound her to Leslie, but it no longer mattered. If this life meant living in complicity with cruelty, she would rather walk away. She approached Leslie with a firmness her mother had never seen in her before. Her words were calm, deliberate, every syllable cutting through the air with precision. She told Leslie that unless she left the Dupree family in peace, she would leave. She would not only leave the house, the fortune, and the parties, but she would walk away from their relationship entirely. Leslie had heard such words before, but always in passing, always softened by hesitation. This time, however, there was no hesitation. Eva's voice did not shake. Leslie, true to her nature, laughed it off at first. She told Eva she was being dramatic, that this was simply a phase, a fleeting storm of youthful morality. She told her she would always have a place in the mansion, that when she came to her senses she would return. She said Eva would have nowhere else to go, because who would accept her if she turned her back on wealth, on privilege? But Eva was prepared for that argument. She had thought it through, turning it over in her mind countless times before she spoke. And then she delivered the words that shattered her mother's certainty. She would go to Ted. She would build a relationship with him, her estranged father, and she would carve out a life apart from Leslie. The shock on Leslie's face was immediate, visceral. For once, her confidence faltered. The idea that her daughter would choose Ted, a man she despised, a man who had once stood among those who ridiculed her, was more unbearable than losing wealth itself. She stared at Eva, her voice trembling despite herself, and said the words that altered everything, "Ted is not your father." The silence that followed was deafening. Eva felt her chest tighten, her heart pounding so loud she thought the whole room must hear it. For a moment, she could not breathe. Was this the truth? Or was it another manipulation, another cruel twist of her mother's endless games? She searched Leslie's face for the answer, but all she saw was desperation, raw and naked in a way she had never seen before. If it was true, then her whole life had been built on a lie. If it was false, then Leslie had stooped to the lowest tactic imaginable, willing to sever her daughter's sense of self just to keep control. Either way, Eva knew she could not remain. The very fact that she had to wonder, the very fact that her mother had poisoned the possibility of truth, was enough. No matter what the answer was, she had to leave. Eva told her mother she was leaving regardless. She told her that no matter what bloodline bound them, there were limits, and Leslie had crossed them all. She told her that every choice has a cost, and if Leslie continued to live without limits, she would end up alone, no one left to share her victories, no one left to see her triumphs. What good would wealth and status be then, when all that remained was silence and shadows? Leslie's face twisted with rage and heartbreak, emotions colliding in a storm she could not contain. But Eva did not flinch. She turned from her mother's opulence, from the glittering chandeliers and polished floors, and she walked into uncertainty with a steadiness that surprised even herself. It was not just a rebellion, it was liberation. What followed was not easy. Freedom rarely is. Eva found herself staring at the emptiness of choices she had never made before. Without her mother's influence, she had to learn what it meant to live on her own terms, to define herself outside the gilded cage. And though Ted welcomed her, confusion lingered. Was he truly her father? Could she trust the bond they were beginning to form, or was it built on a lie planted by Leslie's venomous tongue? Each interaction with Ted was layered with warmth and suspicion, comfort and doubt. He treated her with a kindness that felt genuine, but Leslie's words rang in her mind like a curse. At night, when she lay awake in her small apartment, far from the marble halls she had once called home, Eva wrestled with questions that had no answers. But even in the uncertainty, there was a strange sense of peace. For the first time, her choices were her own. The air was thinner, harsher, but real. Every tear she shed was hers, not something orchestrated by her mother's games. Meanwhile, Leslie spiraled. Her daughter's departure was a wound she could not show to the world, but it consumed her in private. She tried to bury the pain under more wealth, more grandeur, more public displays of triumph. She hosted larger parties, dressed in brighter gowns, surrounded herself with sycophants who whispered flattery into her ears. But when the music faded and the guests left, she was alone, and the silence was louder than any applause. The more Leslie tried to deny it, the more the truth seeped in. Her empire was hollow. Her victories meant nothing without someone to share them with. And worst of all, the one person who had stood by her, even through the years of cruelty, had finally walked away. Eva's absence haunted her like a ghost, whispering through the empty rooms of her mansion, reminding her of every moment she had chosen pride over love. Eva, on the other hand, found herself drawn deeper into questions of identity. Was Ted truly her father? Or was she chasing a phantom connection out of defiance against Leslie? She began digging into the past, piecing together fragments of stories, photographs, old letters. Each discovery led to more questions, each answer veiled in contradictions. Ted, for his part, seemed reluctant to speak of the past, as though there were wounds he, too, had buried. His silence only fueled her doubts. And in those moments, she wondered if Leslie had not been lying after all. But Eva knew one thing with certainty: even if the truth was painful, it would be better than living under lies. She had chosen the harder path, and she would see it through, no matter where it led. And if her mother wanted to hold on to her empire of illusions, then so be it. The gates had opened, and there was no turning back. Eva's determination to leave Leslie behind marked not the end of the conflict but the beginning of an even darker struggle, one where truth and deception tangled like vines around every step she took. The words Leslie had thrown at her, "Ted is not your father," echoed with poisonous weight. Ted, who had accepted her without hesitation, seemed willing to let the past stay buried. Yet Eva, restless and haunted, could not let go of the uncertainty. She searched his face during their conversations, looking for some flicker of dishonesty, some sign that Leslie's revelation was more than just another weapon. His kindness was disarming, but the silence he maintained about the past made her question everything. For Ted, the return of Eva into his life reopened wounds he had tried to forget. Years ago, he and Leslie had been entangled in a brutal relationship defined by power, manipulation, and betrayal. When she left him, she did not just walk away, she made sure to scorch the earth beneath his feet, leaving him isolated, broken, and without the daughter he thought was his own. Seeing Eva now, older, wiser, carrying both Leslie's fire and something gentler he could not place, shook him deeply. Part of him feared to confirm or deny her lineage because either choice would destroy something fragile that was beginning to grow between them. Bill, meanwhile, resurfaced as a figure from Leslie's past who refused to stay silent. Where Leslie had always sought to flaunt her superiority, Bill carried his grudges differently. Time had humbled him, but her constant taunting stirred an old anger that he had buried under years of mediocrity. When he saw Eva walking away from Leslie, he saw an opportunity not just to strike at Leslie's pride, but to find redemption in standing with someone she had hurt. Bill approached Eva cautiously, his presence a reminder of the tangled web Leslie had spun decades before. For Eva, this was both unsettling and strangely clarifying. Here was a man her mother had once destroyed in spirit, a man who had mocked her but also been crushed by her vengeance. He carried the scars of Leslie's cruelty, scars that mirrored the ones Eva bore in her heart. The tension between mother and daughter only deepened as weeks passed. Leslie, refusing to admit her empire was crumbling, doubled down on her obsession with appearances. She threw herself into gatherings, draping herself in jewels, building spectacles of grandeur that screamed of control while whispering of desperation. Ted was forced back into her orbit as whispers of Eva's connection to him spread among their circle. Leslie used every weapon at her disposal: rumors, veiled threats, emotional manipulation to paint Eva's choice as betrayal. To the world, Leslie pretended she was unshaken, but in the privacy of her estate, the walls themselves seemed to collapse under the weight of her solitude. The truth about Eva's parentage became the silent war. Ted's reluctance to answer, Leslie's venomous claim, and Eva's relentless pursuit all converged into a storm. The more Eva pressed, the more Ted withdrew, not out of malice but fear. He knew the truth, but he also knew what it would do not just to Eva, but to the fragile balance between them all. Some truths, he believed, could destroy more than lies ever could. Yet Eva, burning with the desire to carve her life away from her mother's shadow, refused to live with doubt. Her search grew dangerous as she began prying into records, contacting people from her mother's past, piecing together the fragments of a life Leslie had spent years burying. Bill and Ted, once enemies bound by Leslie's cruelty, found themselves reluctantly drawn together. Both had been pawns in her games, and both had been scarred by her need for control. Watching Eva struggle, they recognized the same fire that had once been crushed in them. Slowly, almost reluctantly, They began to ally themselves not out of trust, but out of necessity. Each knew that Leslie's grip would never release unless she was confronted not just by her daughter, but by the men whose lives she had twisted. Leslie sensed the shift long before she saw it. Her instincts, honed by years of battling real and imagined enemies, told her the walls were closing in. And though she wore her usual mask of confidence, she felt the isolation sharpen into something unbearable. Eva's words haunted Hardhat without limits. She would end up alone. The irony was that even as she clung to her empire, she felt it crumbling beneath her. The grandeur was still there, the money still hers, but the people who once gave her victories meaning had either left her or turned against her. Pride, the one constant she had relied on, became her only companion. Eva's confrontation with Leslie came not in a single dramatic moment but in a slow, suffocating spiral. Every time they crossed paths, whether in public or private, the air thickened with words unsaid and wounds unhealed. Eva's anger had cooled into something sharper resolve. She no longer screamed or pleaded, she simply lived her life apart from Leslie, a quiet defiance that was louder than any accusation. And Leslie, who thrived on control and reaction, found the silence unbearable. Her daughter's absence, her refusal to be manipulated, was a mirror she could not escape. The climax built not around wealth or spectacle but around truth. When Ted finally spoke, it was not in grandeur but in trembling honesty. He told Eva the truth about her parentage, how Leslie had concealed the reality of her conception, how he had once believed her his own but had later been forced to accept otherwise. He confessed his silence had been born of fear. Fear of losing her again after she had finally come back into his life. The revelation shattered Eva's world, yet strangely, it also freed her. The lie, once exposed, no longer had power over her. Leslie's cruelty could not dictate her sense of self anymore. She was not defined by her bloodline, by her mother's manipulations, or even by the fractured ties of her family. She was defined by the choices she made now. Bill, witnessing this unraveling, found a grim sense of satisfaction. Not in Eva's pain, but in Leslie's unraveling. For years, he had been the target of her ridicule, the object of her obsession with power. To see her empire reduced to loneliness was a justice he had long thought impossible. Yet even he felt the sting of pity as he watched her sink deeper into the prison she had built for herself. For Leslie, the realization came too late. Eva's departure, Ted's honesty, and Bill's presence all collided into the truth she had spent her life avoiding. Everything she had fought for, every cruel act, every display of wealth, had led her here alone in her mansion, the echoes of laughter and applause replaced by silence. She had chased power, but lost love. She had sought revenge, but destroyed the only bond that could have given her meaning. Eva, though scarred by the revelations, stepped forward into a future that was uncertain but her own. She carried the weight of her past, but no longer let it bind her. Ted stood with her, not as a father defined by blood, but as a man who had chosen to care for her, despite everything. Bill, too, found a strange redemption in standing with Eva, not as an enemy but as an ally against the woman who had shaped them all through cruelty. Together, they formed a fragile constellation of broken people seeking light beyond the shadows Leslie had cast. The ending was not one of triumph, but of clarity. Leslie remained in her empire, surrounded by wealth but stripped of connection. Eva moved forward with resilience, determined to build a life defined not by vengeance but by choice. Ted, haunted but honest, found solace in finally facing the truth. And Bill, scarred yet resolute, discovered that even the deepest wounds could shift into something resembling healing. What lay ahead was uncertain, but it was real. And for Eva, that was enough. The gates that had once trapped her within her mother's world had opened, and beyond them lay not a promise of perfection, but of possibility, a chance to live without chains, no matter what shadows remained. As the dust settled on the storms that had torn through their lives, Eva found herself standing in the quiet spaces between endings and beginnings. The revelations had scarred her, but they had also freed her. She no longer carried the weight of uncertainty about who she was. Bloodline mattered less than the choices she had made to walk away from cruelty and toward truth. And now, in the strange calm that followed chaos, She began to imagine what her life could be beyond the shadows of Leslie's empire. Ted became a steady presence, not because of what he represented in her past but because of what he offered in her present. He did not try to play the role of a father he had been denied. Instead, he became something more genuine, a companion in resilience, a reminder that broken bonds could still form new shapes if both sides were willing. Their relationship grew slowly, built on shared meals, long conversations, and moments of silence where neither needed to fill the void with empty words. For Eva, this was enough. It was not about rewriting the past, but about creating a future on their own terms. Bill, too, lingered at the edges of this new chapter. At first, Eva had struggled to understand why he stayed connected, why a man once complicit in Leslie's cruelty would now try to stand as her ally. But over time, she saw the truth. He sought redemption, not just for himself but for the wasted years he had spent in Leslie's orbit. He carried his own burdens, his own regrets, and in Eva he found a chance to prove that people could choose differently, even after decades of mistakes. Their alliance was uneasy, but it was real, forged not from trust alone but from the shared understanding of what Leslie had taken from them. Meanwhile, Leslie's isolation grew into something tangible, a presence that haunted the halls of her mansion. The grand gatherings became rarer, the jewels heavier on her shoulders, the silks stiffer against her skin. Without Eva, every victory felt hollow. The applause of strangers meant nothing when her daughter's absence echoed louder than any praise. She wandered through her empire like a ghost, clutching her pride as though it could shield her from the truth Eva had thrown at her. Without limits, she would be alone. And now she was. The question that lingered, however, was whether Leslie would ever break free from the cycle she had created for herself. Pride was both her armor and her cage. Even in her darkest solitude, she refused to admit defeat. She told herself Eva would return, that Ted and Bill were weak men propping her up in rebellion, that time itself would bring her daughter back to her. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form. In the quietest hours of night, when the house was still and her reflection stared back at her with merciless honesty, Leslie wondered if Eva had been right all along. The thought gnawed at her, a shadow she could not chase away. Eva, far removed from that gilded prison, began to shape a life that was smaller in scale but larger in meaning. She found work, not glamorous, not enviable, but honest. She built friendships outside the sphere of influence her mother had once controlled, learning what it meant to be valued not for her last name but for her presence. And though doubts remained about her origins, about the scars Leslie had carved into her, she no longer let them define her. She carried them as reminders, not chains. The true ending was not a confrontation of fire and spectacle but a quiet acknowledgement of what had been lost and what had been found. Ted accepted his role not as father but as chosen family. Bill, scarred yet resolute, discovered a semblance of peace in standing against Leslie's grip. Eva embraced the uncertainty of her path, finding strength not in answers but in the freedom of choice. And Leslie, though she never admitted it aloud, was left to face the silence she had once believed she could outrun. In this silence lay the possibility of change, though no one knew if she would ever seize it. Perhaps she would remain locked in her mansion, a queen of ashes ruling over emptiness. Or perhaps, in the solitude Eva had warned her of, she might finally see that true wealth was not in conquest but in connection. The gates had opened for Eva, but whether they would ever open for Leslie remained a question that only time could answer. The story closed not with a battle won or lost, but with the recognition that every choice carves a path, and every path leads to consequences that no one can escape. Eva had chosen freedom, and with it came pain, doubt, and resilience. Leslie had chosen pride, and with it came isolation. Ted had chosen honesty, even when it shattered what little remained. And Bill had chosen redemption, even if it could never erase the past. Together, their lives became a testament to the simple, brutal truth: happiness cannot be built on cruelty, and power without love is nothing but emptiness. As Eva looked forward, she did not know what the future would hold, but she knew it would be hers. And for the first time, that was enough.